Thank you. Buongiorno. That's all the Italian I know, unfortunately. I am really grateful to be here today, to be part of this conversation. My father read Limits to Growth when I was 6, and being an organic chemist, he integrated the findings and recommendations into his talks to his chemistry community and public talks that he gave. But I'd like to think that his biggest success is teaching me how important this issue is, so that I could actually also contribute. So being a psychologist, I'm going to take a slightly different direction here, and I'm going to make a controversial proposal. I'm going to say there are no environmental problems, and everybody goes, yes, there are environmental problems, but calling them that suggests that it's the environment that is the problem, and frankly, it is our human behavior that is the problem. The way we try and fulfill our needs and wants is clearly damaging our ecosystems. And so we have to address our human behavior. In the last day, I have been listening carefully to, especially during the debate period, I've been hearing lots of words that are very psychological in relevance. So I've been hearing words about emotions like fear and hope, and words about behavior such as leadership and change, and words about beliefs like the value of science and the value of data and the importance of morals and ethics. So it is no surprise that psychology is a very relevant field to integrate into multidisciplinary teams. So one question that was a kind of rhetorical question that somebody mentioned yesterday is, are we not aware of what's going on? Well, worldwide, when research is done on whether people believe that climate change is occurring, there's a majority of people who believe yes. Even in the United States, at least half the people believe that climate change is occurring, and likewise, there's a critical mass of people who are very worried about it. In some areas of the world, there's more worry, like in Latin America and Europe, than perhaps in the United States and other areas. So it's not necessarily that we don't understand that it's something that we have to deal with. But let's say, okay, we're aware. Now, why aren't we doing anything about it? And I think this is the theme that emerged most out of the questions is, I think there was a really interesting slide yesterday that said, just act stupid, right? Do you remember that one? And it's frankly not that easy. So I thought I would talk to you a little bit about what it takes to actually behave. And so hopefully you'll walk away with a few tools that you can integrate into your work. So a lot of what we try to do under the circumstances of trying to mitigate or adapt to climate change and other environmental stressors, we ask people to make changes in their personal lives. And I propose that this is really problematic on 3 different levels. And one is that the road from knowledge to action is very complex. There's something called an attitude-behavior gap that is present in everything we do. If you've ever had made a New Year's resolution, you know that those don't last. It is hard to change, and there are a multitude of reasons that I'll mention quickly. Asking people to change their personal behavior requires them to work against really enormous systems. So we're talking systems, food systems, transportation systems, energy systems. These are really big, strong systems, and we're not as strong as individuals. Thirdly, it asks us to do very private things, which have limited scope and limited impact. And I argue that there are ways we can behave that have a much bigger impact on change. So I'm going to talk about each one of these briefly in turn. So why doesn't knowledge translate directly into behavior change? Well, there are lots of external and internal factors that affect whether we act on our ideas. For instance, we depend on our senses in order to understand what's going on around us and to respond appropriately. The systems, both the natural systems that we're embedded in as well as the human-made systems, are incredibly complex, and so it is not intuitive to us necessarily how these things work. So that's one limitation. Another thing is problems such as climate change, at least up until now, have been very slow to emerge. We've known that they're emerging, and they are emerging, but the speed at which they emerge is not detectable in the same way that we're evolved to try and manage change. Also, there's a psychological distance between our personal lives and what we think of when we think about climate change. So climate change typically is thought of as something that will happen in the future, very far away from us, and to other people, at least for most of us in this room. And then finally, our built systems are often built for convenience, and that convenience means that we can just walk into a store, grab what we need, and walk away and do other things. It means that where our materials come from is a mystery to us. We don't know how long they took to make, how far they've traveled, what they're made of, and so we can't really make very good decisions when we don't know those factors. So those are just a variety of reasons why, why it's really hard to even just think about these changes. The important bottom line for this is that our senses are what give us information that trigger our emotions, and our emotions are the things that lead us to behave. They provide motivation. We avoid things that distress us. We gravitate to things that are positive and feel good. And so the fact that we really can't even sense these things really doesn't get us the momentum that we need in order to change. Some other ways that we think about the environment that are problematic is that most of us, especially in an urban environment, don't really get our relationship with the environment, the natural world, the planet. So, we kind of think, well, we're part of, economy, but boy, that the planetary stuff, that's out there. And if I ever have time and money, I will pay attention to it. But until then, I'm going to work on, getting jobs and dealing with the economy. Now, the way we represent sustainability, it sort of tries to bring those ideas together so that they're more coordinated. And of course, we're sort of looking for the sweet spot where society, economy, and environment are all part of the consideration in our decisions. But even this representation sort of suggests that, there's some part of the economy that somehow can carry on even if it's not attached to environmental ideas. So there's yet a third way of imagining how we relate to the environment, which I think actually better captures the realities, and that is that everything we have and do as a society and as a part of an economy is a function of the environment. And so our interdependence is much better represented in this diagram. But this is not necessarily how we think about it. It may be a really good way to help other people understand that it's not just a nicety someday to deal with the environment when we have time, but it is something that we depend on 100%. So this conference has been doing a really good job of trying to move us from a very old way of thinking to a new way of thinking. So over time and over experience, we all develop a worldview. This is an understanding of how the world works. And the Western sort of worldview has been developed over hundreds of years, so it's very strong, it's very deeply embedded in the way we think about things. It's how we learn from the time we're toddlers about how things operate. Things like, you can take whatever you need or whatever you want, and that you can grab stuff from the earth, use it for a while, and then toss it out. These are just ideas that are almost second nature to people in the developed world, and they survived for hundreds of years because they worked within a world where we hadn't yet reached our planetary boundaries. But frankly, you've seen in the last couple of days, we have surpassed those planetary boundaries, and so we need to start thinking differently. And having these conversations is really the learning we have to do to transform from the old way of thinking to thinking in circular economies and understanding limited resources and understanding our complex interdependence with the planet. So from a social perspective, we evolved in small groups, and typically millennia ago, if we were rejected from groups, we tended not to survive, and so our genetic structure really gravitates toward being accepted by groups because we just survived in groups. And so even if we don't like to believe it, we constantly are surveying our environment for social information. So we watch what other people do, especially in new situations. When we don't really know how to behave, we watch others so that we can behave likewise and not be rejected. Similarly, we pay attention to how people respond to us when we behave. So if I show up, driving by myself in a big SUV vehicle, and somebody says, "Whoa, cool car," I've been rewarded for this unsustainable behavior. That social reward is incredibly powerful. One recent study in the United States, which has to be replicated elsewhere to necessarily be generalizable, but it illustrates how we change our behavior depending on whether we think we're going to be accepted or not. This diagram shows what's called pluralistic ignorance. It means that if we think the person we're going to be talking to disagrees with us, we will actually fail to bring up really important information. So we'll fail to talk about climate change if we believe in it, but we think the people we're talking to don't. Likewise, if I don't believe in climate change, I'm unlikely to speak up about that idea if I think that I don't have a receptive audience. Now, this was in a contrived situation where people knew who they might be talking to. Most of the time, we don't know who we're going to be talking to, and that adds another element of uncertainty that keeps us from really stepping out of our personal sphere. So that's the first problem with asking people to change their individual behavior, is that just because we know better doesn't mean that it's easy to start behaving in line with that. So the second issue is that asking people to change their personal choices requires them to work against these enormous systems. There are a couple problems with this. For one, there's a small return on individual effort. So what individual behavior is doing is asking everybody in their individual houses to turn down their thermostat or turn off their lights. And yes, some may do that, but most will forget. And so it's a really hit or miss sort of proposition, where the real problem is in the power station itself. And behavior economists who are now getting Nobel Prizes are adamant that we need to actually make the default for behavior the sustainable behavior and make people work harder for the things that are unsustainable. So so the second problem with asking people to go against enormous systems is that it's usually very painful in some way, shape, or form for a human to do this. We avoid punishment almost at all costs. And behaving against systems is often punishing. It either leads to discomfort, it may take more time, it often costs more money. And so these are things that will stop us from taking on those behaviors. Interestingly is that asking people to work against a system requires a lot of cognitive effort. Now, cognition requires our brain to work. Our brains require lots of calories. Historically, we had to save those calories and those big thoughts for the emergency situations, and so we don't like to spend a lot of time thinking deeply about every little choice. So we're often actually called cognitive misers for this reason. We save up all of that thought. So anytime a decision requires us to seek out new information or look harder or investigate more in order to do the right thing, we tend to fail or avoid it. Now, how many of you are engineers or architects in training or otherwise? Excellent. So this is a huge opportunity for you because you have an important role of considering what kind of human behaviors you are guiding and encouraging through the designs that you create. So the third feature of asking people to change their individual behavior is that it really only focuses on the private sphere. It's choices like what you eat and how you get to work. So what's the matter with these things? Well, nothing, really. We certainly do want people to bike and walk and take public transportation instead of driving individually in automobiles. But even our highest impact personal choices are not going to get us where we need in terms of reduction in greenhouse gases in the next 12 years. And so we need to go bigger than that. And so I propose that what matters more or even just simultaneously, it's a both and. We need to both do our private sphere things and public sphere things, especially because we don't want to be hypocrites, right? We don't want to tell people to do things when we're not doing them ourselves. So it's important to do the personal things, but we need to expand our repertoire. We need to actually work within our social networks to make sure that the information we have gets transmitted throughout networks. We need to behave differently within our organizations, and I'll talk a lot more about that in a minute. And we also have power within our private sphere. And these are the things that are really going to drive change in the big systems that are blocking our current behavior. So, policy support. Politicians are rewarded for the short term. Their short-term successes determine whether they get reelected or not. And so it's important for constituents to indicate to their representatives what they want to see in the short term that aligns with our long-term goals of survival. Now, this works best at the local level. We've heard that several times in the last day or two. But basically, protesting, writing letters to elected leaders, supporting campaigns, voting, these are all things that those of us, especially in this room, generally have access to and should leverage as much as possible. Social networks. There's a theory called diffusion of innovation, and this is how new ideas get transmitted into the general population. And I would argue that academics are down here. We're the innovators. We come up with new ideas and new things. Unfortunately, most of us are introverted, and we've been trained not to advocate, and so our ideas kind of sit there until somebody else decides to try them out. And so these are known as early adopters. Early adopters are essential to our ideas in here getting out. It means advocating in a world where that hasn't been very accepted in academia. But we have to go out, we have to find the people who will transmit our ideas to a more general population. Typically, early adopters, and especially the people who follow the early adopters, tend to be well connected and have many, many people on social media and in their social lives that they then can in turn pass the innovation to, and then eventually there's a critical mass or a tipping point where it becomes part of our popular culture. But what I want to spend most of my time on is how we need to be asking individuals to change the organizations they belong to. And we've already talked about governments, but there are formal and informal organizations that we all belong to that we actually have some power to change. I'm going to focus primarily on industry here. And the way that business organizations in industry change is by people wielding power. There are a great variety of sources of power. Many people develop expertise, and if they use it and succeed and are trustworthy, then people will go to them and trust their ideas, listen to them when change needs to happen. Another type of power is referent power, and this is the power that people have when they're well-liked or where they're well-respected. Other people want to be like them. Other people want to be with them. Other people want to copy them. So this is a very powerful kind of power. It has an enormous reach. And then there's legitimate power. And legitimate power is when people are elected or appointed to particular positions where they have titles and they're supposed to lead. Now, whether or not this power is effective depends on some other things, too. It's neither necessary nor sufficient to create change. For instance, if somebody who's been voted into power has no expertise, they might be able to lead for a little while, but eventually people stop following because they know that the person doesn't know what they're doing. When somebody who has a legitimate position, however, has referent power, this is a very powerful combination where they not only have titles and tasks that they are responsible for, but then people listen to them, they respond well to them because of the respect they've developed. Now, you can be a leader without having a legitimate title, and that's the type of leadership that is really needed when we need to totally transform an organization or totally transform a body of people, is what is called transformational leadership. And one of its key features is that a transformational leader has to be believed and they have to be trusted and respected. But then this isn't the only feature as well. Transformational leaders also display passion. They wear it on their sleeve. Like, if I believe in climate change and I think we need to do something about it, I am out there saying it out loud. And this requires a lot of courage in a world where you might be rejected for that idea. One other feature of this transformational leadership is humility. And the idea that sometimes leaders just have to step into the background and empower others to do the work that needs to be done. And so this actually feeds into a very substantial need we have as humans for autonomy. We don't like to be told what to do. We like to be told that we should find the right thing to do and then be left to do it. And so transformational leaders both show an encouragement of critical thinking and an empowerment and a sort of a cheerleading support to say, yes, I believe in you, you're doing this, you're coming along fine. So transformational leadership, unfortunately, is not enough either, because there are a lot of transformational leaders out there who have the old mindset of the sort of Western industrial worldview where it's the extraction, creation, and then throwing away of things. And for them, transforming into sustainability means just sort of tweaking it a little bit just being a little bit better or a little less worse. Whereas what we need is transformational leaders who really get what you've been talking about here for the last 2 days, which is a different way of thinking. Now, unluckily, we have transformational leaders who don't get the ecological realities, and we have people who get the ecological realities who are really not yet transformational leaders. And what we need is to combine those two things. They are just not typically found together, but we can actually foster that. For instance, we can teach leadership. Transformational leadership is teachable. We can teach people to develop humility and to be more courageous about their passions. And then likewise, we actually can train people to think differently. Part of it is just learning, just sitting and getting the cognitive information input. But also, sometimes it's practicing. There are tons of games out there that we can play to learn things like the tragedy of the commons and limited resources, or how systems work. And who doesn't love a game? So this is a really great way to get people involved in viscerally feeling these different ways of thinking about the world. Now, I have written here ecological worldview as a competency. And what that means is that in organizations, we have lots of diverse people doing really different things, but sometimes there are some shared skills that we expect. So in this case, a shared understanding of this different way of thinking would be considered a competency. So I would encourage organizations to take time to train people the things that you've been learning in here, but also helping them imagine how that it translates into practice. There are lots of benefits of having shared competencies in organizations. For one thing, it gives us common ground so that we can understand each other and where we're coming from. It gives us a common language so that when we can problem solve, we can ask questions like, well, how does it affect our limited access to resources? Or like, how is that circular? Why is it, could we change it to be circular? So we get common language. It allows us to ask good questions. It's impossible to know everything about everything. It'd be great if everybody could spend 5 days learning about this stuff, but most of us have lots of other things to do. And so what we need to do is learn sort of a more heuristic set of ideas rather than all the minutiae of data. But if we understand that there are limited resources, that we need circular systems, that we're deeply interconnected, those can lead to some really interesting questions, really insightful questions. And it can also give us criteria for judging the quality of the solutions that we develop. And then, like I mentioned before, when we give people sort of some basic rules, they can be on their own to develop methods of acting that are appropriate. They can be given the autonomy to make choices that they deem true or good given those guidelines. And if we all share this common understanding, the likelihood of being rejected for your ideas is diminished. Now, one last idea, and that is that there are systems within organizations that drive human behavior. They're found in human resource departments, and the idea is that systematically we design jobs, we recruit people to become part of our organization, we put them through a process to determine who's the best candidate, we bring them on, we train them, we evaluate their performance over time, and we give them rewards if they're doing a good job. If this is systematically aligned, and then it's a very sensical thing for humans. So if we want people to be sustainable, but we're still focusing on things like simply the bottom line economically, or who's bringing in the most money, we are not going to get sustainable behavior. In order to get sustainable behavior, we have to expect this competency to be part of every job description. It has to be part of how we recruit people. We will expect you, if you come work for us, to do these things. It's part of the questions we ask when we're asking somebody to whether they'd be a good candidate for the job. It's part of our training programs. It's how we get evaluated. it's also how we can reward people. So it needs to be integrated throughout the way organizations' structures are designed. And then one last thought to wrap this up in the next 30 seconds. Communication is really difficult. It's very important, and words matter, and ideas matter. And so there are some things that are really important based on what we've been doing the last 2 days. Framing the problem in terms of its relevance to each human is really important. Yes, polar bears and other species are on the brink of extinction or already extinct. Yes, we are losing our icebergs and our ice shelves. But for somebody who has to deal with picking up the kids and deciding whether they've got enough money to afford this apartment or that apartment, this is not relevant. And so it's important to create the sense of urgency, but then to pull it down into the relevance realm. How does this affect me? In Minnesota, it means you need to talk about the forests and the fish, because those are the things that are important to Minnesotans. And I'm sure there are things here in Turin and elsewhere where you can find the direct impacts locally that will create that emotional push to actually behave. And then also, we need to talk about what we want to avoid, but we have to present a beautiful, comfortable, attractive vision of the future we want, because this is what's going to get people up in the morning to do things differently. So thank you very much for your time.